Michael Lind's The New Class War: Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite. It's a really interesting book. It came out in 2020, and what I want to do here is review it. So as I kind of read it myself, provide a sort of discussion, review, etc., some quotes from the book, and then pull together some ideas from both Lind himself, from a couple other interviews, and articles that I've found of him, but also sort of link it into a sort of larger topic area that I've been really interested in the past couple of years, which can be termed as trying to understand this sort of populism movement in the West, so to speak, or in America and Europe. And for me, what's interesting there is a couple things. So the sort of shift in political party or left-right positions towards populism, and maybe the people who would be voting for quote unquote populists, the way the media frames the debates and the voters, etc., and just sort of using the theme as a sort of jump off point to discuss quite a few different societal issues at this point. I mean, so that's a lot to ask for a book review of a given 250-page book. I hope to splinter this off into various topics, but as this is my first go, I'm just going to try and pack a lot into sort of the context of what this book means within that larger space that I just described. And it is what it is. So I need to change the topic of this talk in the end, so it's less of a review of Lind and more of an intro discussion to populism and its discontents, or liberalism and its discontents. Then so be it. But this is sort of the starting point. Yeah, so just sort of inspired by Kansas's Laurie Johnson, who is an amazing resource with hundreds of hours of book reviews or book discussions, lectures on some really interesting thinkers. I want to try and do the same here. So she hasn't done Lind. I'll point to her website and some of the great books that she's done or talked about. And what I like about how she does her reviews is, or her discussions or her lectures, is you kind of walk away with an understanding of the book. So she also puts up nice quotes from the book itself. But you get her swing, or her take on the book. It's not to say you wouldn't need to read the book in order to summarize the author themselves, but for me, you can take her lecture about the book as its own thing, and nonetheless as something like a close summary of what the book actually is, and have enough thought-provoking and interesting information or lecturing, etc. there. Not that I can replicate what she's doing. She's an incredible sort of talker, thinker, and also certainly coming from a interesting position these days. So I recommend checking her out. But still, I mean, that's the sort of theme that I want to use for or the approach that I want to use for these reviews, essentially. So I want to situate this book within the larger discussion. I tried to approach it with a take, basically, I mean, a literal video take yesterday, where I just tried to jump right into the book, and I realized without framing a bit the sort of larger intellectual discussion around discontent with the current West, so to speak, it's difficult to put this book into perspective and discuss it. So I try to pop out and sort of just give an overview of some terms in discussion, defining and talking a bit about what liberalism is and sort of the history of the idea there. And I mean, I'm not a political theorist. I'm a guy with a master's in economics who's worked in the tech sector and a little bit at a think tank, so for several years. But nonetheless, I'm not a academic political theorist. So I point to nice sources where you can go check this stuff out yourself. I mean, you can take my description for what it is, and yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to allege more than that about my understanding of some of these topics, but it is what it is. So I mean, I'm framing the discussion to start talking about it. So let's just jump back to Lind for a second. This book puts forth an interesting thesis that what describes sort of the modern Western social economic system these days is this managerial elite, as Lynn calls them. So it's something like 10% of society who are university educated, have a certain sort of homogenous set of views, which are conditioned by the education and sort of cultural class system that they come from or aspire to be a part of. And there's some degree of reciprocating itself within the, literally the same groups of people, but of course in the West, so in America or Canada or England or Germany, with immigration and some degree of social mobility, of course there's movement, enormous movement, bloodline, in terms of the descendants of people into this group. It's more of a sort of idea set that the managerial class takes on or sort of replicates with some degree of actual, parent to child to grandchild, etc. As more people people enter the group, and yeah, so I mean, it's a nice way to frame the sort of group thinky. In 2020, it would be kind of left wokey, political correct set of values that you find basically anywhere that the elite are. So if we take its definition, this is anywhere in media, anywhere in managerial positions, in tech, in government, in business, teachers, likely, not always, but if you start to paint this larger group of people who have this sort of shared set of views about the way society should work, what family means, the degree to which their own success is a result of sort of meritocratic processes, etc. So I'll get deeper into the ideas, but there's a reasonable chance that you're in this class, or you're going to be, or you're coming somehow from it if you're watching these videos. Not necessarily, but a lot of the time, the type of people who would be talking about these ideas and listening to me, somehow would be, themselves part of the class and would largely adhere to the ideas that that I'm going to describe, or that Lynn describes. I think it's still fuzzy how I'm describing it. I'm trying to frame it within the larger debate, and then I want to get to it, from a couple of different angles. So let's again step out as I described. I want to sort of frame this larger debate. So let's talk about 2015 on, for instance, Brexit, Trump, discontent with the EU from various parties in Western Europe, also in Eastern Europe. Although Lind himself is quite clear that his model of this managerial elite and his sort of larger model for describing society is really applicable only in his eyes to the States and Western Europe. So he doesn't try and stretch it to even Eastern Europe, which is good. I mean, in my opinion, which is the way to think about these things. You need quite a high degree of country or region specific historical and cultural knowledge in order to make piercing, correct, or even on near the mark statements about the way a society works. And funny enough, I think that's sort of a symptom or an attribute of a lot of academic discussion, especially from the liberal left on populism. That's one of its failures. It tries to provide this sort of universalistic description and solution to really regional or country specific situations, essentially. So without jumping all over the place here, there's a couple nice articles that exemplify this. Not nice, necessarily in the sense of their analysis. There's a Timothy Gard-Nash paper or whatever article on liberalism from, I think, December 2020, so just a couple months ago, that I'll link to, that's really an example of this. And I think it's quite useful to read. It's not that it's not that it's wrong in any sense. It's just that as you're sort of reading the description, both of what's wrong with populists and what's good about liberalism and how to save it, it's just you have to ask yourself, what am I reading here? What is being sort of proposed, as opposed to just kind of lip service to a set of ideas that sound good when described, so to speak. So let's tighten back up here. I grabbed from a 2020 October Fukuyama piece, again on liberalism, just some quotes that I think help frame this. So he actually provides a nice discussion again on liberalism. I think the paper is actually called Liberalism and its Discontents. So he starts with democracy is under attack. So that's kind of the idea of the paper. And then the democracy that is under attack is liberal democracy. So he pulls a nice distinction here. Democracy is the part that refers to the accountability of those who hold political power through mechanisms like free and fair multi-party elections under universal franchise. And there's direct threats to democracy, not to liberalism, in China, in Russia, etc., as he describes it. But the thing that he's more interested in, or the sort of more nuanced or creeping problem or fear, is the attack on liberalism, as he frames it, and as typically anti-populist thinkers would frame it, is, and again, the quote, "The liberal part, by contrast, refers primarily to a rule of law that constrains the power of government and requires that even the most powerful actors in the system operate under the same general rules as ordinary citizens. Liberal democracies, in other words, have a constitutional system of checks and balances that limit the power of elected leaders." And here, as you can imagine, I mean, if you're following the space piece, so Poland, Orban, aspects of Brexit, Trump, are all grouped in here as sort of attacking or threatening liberalism. So they're not necessarily threatening democracy as described or alleged by Fukuyama, but they certainly are attacking or undermining the liberalism side of the liberal democracy. So he describes classical liberalism as an institutional solution to the problem of governing over a diverse group of people, which arose in England in sort of 16th, 17th century. Or to put it in slightly different terms, it is a system for peacefully managing diversity in pluralistic societies. So initially, as Fukuyama describes it, the purpose of liberal systems was to lower the aspirations of politics with no specific goal to promote the good life as defined by a particular religious viewpoint or even national culture, but rather simply to preserve life, peace itself, since diverse populations could not agree on the direction that they should take. And he here makes the connection for us. This is sort of the distant origin of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, the freedom to pursue life, liberty, or the right to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Fair enough. And then, according to Fukuyama, various European thinkers added to this the recognition of human dignity and sort of intrinsic rights associated with their individual autonomy, including the right to speech, to assembly, to belief, and to participate in self-government. So these sort of two levels of historical liberalism's development essentially constitute now what we take to mean and describe liberalism. So essentially, anyone living in the West is living in some form or some system which is governed by these sort of principles or axioms. as another person who I'm going to speak about in a second, Yoram Hazony, the Israeli nationalism scholar or biblical scholar who has written a book on nationalism recently, frames it. And then Fukuyama again. So he frames, and this is where I think he's useful for jumping off into the larger sort of subset of discussions, which are, now taking place about why populism exists and why there's these extreme sort of tensions within Western society today. Is the two sort of critiques of liberalism, which we can structure critiques of liberalism in two ways. The first is a little bit more surface, in his opinion, and it has to do with the sort of economic neoliberal sort of policies and economic philosophy, essentially, which emerged sort of from the 70s on, into itself a kind of market fetishing religion almost. And the offshoots of this are, of course, globalization, free trade, small government. I add here financialization, so the sort of prevalence of finance in all sorts of aspects of life and of the economy, where previously banks or financial instruments were not in play. They now are, and there's a sort of creeping level to which finance has a powerful role in everything from education to compensation, and et cetera, insurance, and so on. And then some sort of almost reiterating, but some sort of offshoots of that would be the rising inequality, which is sort of well documented and clear since the 70s, 80s, which continues till today. Again, financialization, the financial crash, the sort of fall of industrialization in the West, so the Rust Belt areas, as both jobs were offshored, the rise of China taking up some of these jobs, the increase in automation and robotization itself, removing some of the need for human labor, and then the emergence and at the same time attack of the welfare state. And here I throw in, additionally, potentially, the at least persistence of racial inequality, if not possibly increase in some aspects of markers which would suggest an unequal racial situation, and the degree to which this itself can be sort of levied on the welfare state. There's some discussion that I don't want to get into at this point, but I think 2020 BLM protests, sort of allegations of disproportionate police violence against blacks, which is statistically questionable, but nonetheless obviously touched a nerve in terms of the sort of subpar life situation of a large percentage of Americans, some large percentage of which are black, often inner city black, maybe 20% of the black population, stuck in very high crime inner city areas, which sort of is a manifestation for a very visible example of a sort of legacy of racism in the United States. Whether or not the situation at this exact moment is strictly the result of racism, in my opinion, being no, but nonetheless. So this is sort of a snapshot of the U.S. under this neoliberal outgrowth of liberalism, as Fukuyama would put it. But then so that's one sort of more surface critique, which can be leveled at liberalism, both in the US and again in Western Europe, which is extremely difficult to solve and extremely problematic for a lot of people, but nonetheless it seems to exist or it seems to be a solution which can be solved within liberalism, within the economic and social system, via redistribution or other policies. Education, for instance, would be alleged, and so on. But then a second, much more fundamental critique of liberalism, according to Fukuyama, and here I would say also according to some quite other interesting conservative thinkers like Patrick Deneen or Hazony, as I just spoke about, is that discontent with liberalism really comes from within liberalism. So it's endogenous to the system itself. By deliberately lowering the horizon of politics, liberalism sort of has this built-in destruction or built-in vacuum. A liberal state, now I'm quoting, will not tell you how to live your life or what a good life entails. How you pursue happiness is up to you. So, I mean, this is a feature for a lot of people. Most of us have been taught this is a feature if we've grown up in the West in the sort of post-Soviet era, let's say. So, if you basically grew up after the 90s and before, but I mean, at that point, there might have been a little bit more of a sort of religious or nationalist undertone to a lot of what was being taught, in the way that the values of a liberal state or liberal country or system were described. Again, Fukuyama, this produces a vacuum at the core of liberal societies, one that often gets filled by consumerism or pop culture or other random activities that do not necessarily lead to human flourishing. So keep in mind, Fukuyama is not a conservative thinker at all. I mean, he started off somewhat conservative with his sort of the end of history, famous essay and then book at the end of the Soviet times. But he's actually a rather center-left thinker at this point. And I would say he's not just describing here what others say. He himself is really recognizing the degree to which this sort of vacuumous liberalist sort of way of life leads to sort of inherent critique of itself. And we don't have to go deeply into it, but you can just look around at, for instance, birth rates in most of the Western world, marriage rates, home ownership rates, etc. Happiness sort of numbers. I mean, most of us have seen these numbers. They seem to be faltering. Let alone life expectancy and health sort of metrics in parts of the West, especially in sort of Rust Belt areas. They seem to be faltering versus 25, 30 years ago in the face of sort of absolute, at least average economic prosperity, and probably even in the face of absolute prosperity, not just average, but even for the people who are themselves sort of self-describedly suffering versus their parents maybe. So it's really pointing to a cause outside of pure economic sort of material suffering, which is not to say that it doesn't exist sort of highly in these societies, but I think a lot of the people who are suffering under some of the ills of liberalism themselves are not necessarily materially suffering too much, or as much as you would think from a sort of utility perspective would be required in order for them to have such poor outcomes in some of the metrics which I just spoke about. And then, so Fukuyama himself refers to Deneen. And if I just return to Laurie Johnson from UKansas, she has a nice 7-video lecture on Deneen, which concludes with an interview with him, which is really nice. Recommend checking that out. Even pausing and going and taking a look there. You might not come back when you end up on her sort of set of videos, but as I said, she provides some very, very nice discussion. So for Deneen, the entire this is Fukuyama describing him, the entire American project, based as it was on Lockean individualistic principles, was misfounded. Human beings for him, Deneen, are not primarily autonomous individuals, but deeply social beings who are defined by their obligations and ties to a range of social structures, from families to kin groups to nations. And just to channel my inner Jordan Peterson for a second here, just to throw something in from him, you'll notice that this entire description is totally absent from popular culture and from what typically we're taught in universities, or what we hear from our families, probably outside of religious backgrounded families, about what the purpose of us is in society, what the purpose of life is, etc. Even to have families and have children is sort of not spoken about, and for the most part in the West these days, at least in the urban West. I can speak about Germany, Canada, the US largely. And yeah, and I think Deneen provides sort of the most fundamental critique there that's gone mainstream recently, which is it's really built directly into the precepts of liberalism. Its sort of downfall, or its missing message, so to speak, or maybe he doesn't. I mean, Yoram Hazony, probably an Orthodox Jewish thinker from Israel, as I said, he probably provides an even more cutting sort of attack of liberalism. So Deneen is a kind of conservative Catholic. Obviously, as I just said, Hazony is a Orthodox Jew. And just to sort of reframe now from the beginning, he describes liberalism as, and what I really like about his description is that he takes a very systems view, and almost so logical or mathematical or systems theory. So I'm very interested in complexity theory and aspects of how systems dynamically develop over time, which I think is a very useful way to describe political, economic, social systems. And he starts from the beginning describing a sort of a system built on a set of dogmas or axioms, as he later says. And I think that as you watch the parts of the system or the axioms which underpin the system play out, or if you think about it in this sort of axiomatic system way versus another set of axioms underpinning a system, you have a sort of different vantage point that we don't usually hear when we're talking about political theory or morals or social life. So liberalism is built on these three premises. Reason is accessible to individuals and dictates political truth that applies universally. So, a typical derivation of Enlightenment thinking, that human beings are reasonable, rational beings, and what constitutes political truth is available to all of us, and it's absolute. It's out there, and via our reason or having someone describe it to us and then thinking about it, we can all reach these same sort of conclusions about the way we should be behaving, within a band of behavior probably, but nonetheless we should arrive at very similar understandings using our reason. All individuals are perfectly free and equal. Again, feature, not a bug, I would say, but it forms part of this set of dogmas or axioms that he's laying out, along with us taking on political and moral obligations to the system, the nation, even our family, I guess, only by consent. So there's no intrinsic obligations that we sort of just have by virtue of, for instance, being born to our family or being part of a country, etc. So, I mean, not to say that these are the direct tenets, especially three here, of a sort of libertarian perspective, but you can see these sort of juxtaposition of these sort of positions with a very libertarian perspective about free agency and consent to engage in economic, social activity, etc. And then what's interesting for Hazony, again, he comes from a religious perspective, but in his eyes, highly progressive, classic liberals or conservatives are all nonetheless under this liberalism system and tenet, so to speak. And regardless of the disagreements they have within this band, whatever can be derived from these tenets falls within the sort of progressive to conservative spectrum. And his sort of critique, again echoing Deneen now, is that liberalism doesn't have any resources or any arguments against extreme political diversity and viewpoints, because without a religious or national or other moral sort of driving axis or force, or there's absolutely no way within these tenets, this sort of rational, free way of arriving at truths, to critique any other truth or any other way of living. And I think that that's truly something that we see in this sort of extreme, so not in the sense of extreme left, extreme right, but just extreme tension between the extreme left, center, conservative right, extreme right positions today. It's difficult not to describe. I mean, yes, it's difficult not to conceive of this as truly the result of a totally unmoored set of values, just working in sort of loops and arriving at certain viewpoints, which don't really mesh up with the next guy, then with the neighbor's opinion, but without any sort of strong driving norms to rank them, or to just jump over the endless discussion, take a kind of heuristic rule of thumb style, we're going to do this because it's just the way things are done position. We're in this constant, as I said, unmoored sort of bickering state. And this would be the kind of logical conclusion of the intrinsic sort of downfall, or the intrinsic instability of liberalism, that that certain critiquers of liberalism can bring forth. So all of that said, yeah, let's skip this one, and let's jump to Lind now. So yeah, let's position Lind within that, I don't know, 15-minute description I just gave. He is certainly within the liberal spectrum, and I want to just get away from using this liberal term. I mean, I don't use this term. I sort of dug it out in order to introduce this whole discussion here. He's not some maniac Marxist or some royalist or whatever who wants to overthrow the government and in the States. He's a run-of-the-mill, probably old left, pro-union kind of thinker. And he describes this managerial elite class, which I sort of talked about at the very beginning of this lecture. And just to give you a sort of almost troped up picture of who he's talking about, I think you'll get the idea as I describe this 10% of society. Typically, I mean, and it doesn't have to be this, right? There's going to be people who would fall within what he calls a managerial elite, who don't meet this description, but just take the idea to begin with. Coastal. So this is a U.S. style description, but you can, if you know UK, or if you know Canada, which is quite similar to the U.S., or if you know Germany, you can make you can make the connection. So typically they're going to be coastal on the west or the east coast, urban, and educated, university educated, that is. They're going to be exclusively Democrats or Remainers, or in Canada they're going to be staunch kind of Trudeau Liberal Party, possibly NDP voters. But now this is a bit me, but nonetheless, they're going to have the answers, quote unquote, about the way society should be structured, who is wrong, evil, racist. So typically the conservative, or the redneck, or the hick, Trump voter, or the Alberta separatist who is against any environmental policy, or the person who voted Brexit. Right. So, I mean, the description is fair enough. The problem with how I'm describing this is many people are going to totally relate to this, and I'm not saying you're bad. I mean, likely, many of these positions I myself tick the boxes on. But typically, they're also going to be extremely, today in 2020, politically correct. So here's another trope, and this is not really said, but they're going to absolutely be unable to critique or criticize anything about, for instance, Black America. So I'm talking about extreme Black violence in the inner city. To even utter these words will make them shudder. You know the type. I mean, it's probably you too, right? To talk about the fact that there's 8,000 or 9,000 Black murder victims and committers of the murders, as it's almost exclusively Black on Black crime per year in the US, is simply not said, and cannot be put forth as a reason to describe sort of very subpar socioeconomic outcomes for at least a large portion of the Black population in the US. Rather, it's, of course, the 8 to 10 unarmed Black people killed by the police every year. You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, I don't need to go much further. I can also point to some nice articles on this, but that sort of politically correct way of thinking and talking, especially about race, would be part of this managerial elite for sure. Newer stuff on race and transgender, on transgender, and a bit on just gender generally. I mean, in my opinion, typically most people in this sort of managerial elite won't adhere to because they haven't got there yet. But as soon as it becomes the real norm in the sort of New York Times, Toronto Star, The Guardian, they'll absorb it very quickly, and it'll be part of their independent thought, which of course it isn't, which they'll parrot, without realizing it. And if they don't do it today, you could survey them all, but they'll do it by 2022 and think that they arrived at it totally independent through their superior morality. So yeah, that's the group. And again, you'll know this group because they're at least as close-minded as their deplorable counterpart. Again, this will rub those people the wrong way, but trust me, that's the way it is. And yeah, so that's this managerial elite, or that's more like their ethos. And then where do they find themselves? So there's sort of this 10%. He has a nice article in the Bellows, which I linked to, which is against the sort of 99.9%, which is what the left wants you to always hear about. And he's quite good about saying how, for them, the sort of extremely high paid teacher or mid-level banker is also in the working class against this 0.1% of super rich who really rule the world. And he says, no, it's more like this 10% who have this entrenched position in media, in government, in tech, in larger companies, in education, in human resource departments, who have this very rigid, locked-in value system, and who sort of have nothing but disgust for typically their own, say if it's white people, typically for like heartland white people, but also for anyone who so that's the part they'll say openly, but then they also don't interact with and have essentially a disgust for urban poor and minorities, although from the politically correct perspective they won't say that, but from their behavior and friend group, etc., it's still part of it, which is not to say that many minorities don't enter the managerial elite, but then as they sort of enter this new class, they're part of their own group together with this other 10%. So Lind has 4 theses about the managerial class, which I've listed out here. I think it's just nice to go through them. And now he moves kind of from the class to describe society and the sort of class's interaction with it. So for him, power and class are words that are not really spoken about anymore. They're sort of almost bad words. So sort of the way that any kind of Marxist talk is a little bit almost embarrassing to bring up, or it was at least, even while I was in university in 2003 to 7, you wouldn't just be espousing Marxist ideas at home at the dinner table, unless you came from an extremely progressive academic family or something, I guess. And talk about power and class still falls into this sort of forbidden set of ideas. So everything is about race or anti-immigrant, or as I was speaking about before, anti-trans these days, but nothing's about class and power anymore. But he puts these ideas right back up at the forefront, or he wants to talk about them. And for him, power in a modern society comes in political, economic, and cultural forms. And just a sidebar, he had a very interesting sort of statement about Zuckerberg, so Facebook and Twitter's banning of Trump at the Jan 6 rallies, or riots, I should say, to be honest. And some of us, myself, for instance, was pretty concerned that these big tech players can ban the president of the U.S. But I was more irked or weirded out that the average person, especially left person, who typically would be or was very skeptical of big business, tech, and censorship, was just cheering this on. So at my work, for instance, there were some discussions on Slack, and the hardcore leftist or Marxist kind of idea or leaning people were totally happy to see future trillionaire Mark Zuckerberg just ban the president over in a second, with his absolute unfettered power that no government in the world could hope to have. And Lind said something to the effect of, well, if you're from the left, or however he described it, you understand that power is not just about political power in the sense of being voted in. It's economic and cultural power. So go ahead tomorrow and start your own Twitter, poor guy on the street, and see how far you get. And that is power. That's a description of power that's extremely powerful, and I think we can all relate to. And ironically, the sort of parroted line that I heard at my workplace, but you also hear it on mainstream media, is if you don't like it, like now talking about Trump being banned from these private communication platforms, go start your own Twitter. And it's said with a straight face by left-leaning people who ostensibly have been exposed to critique of tech and power forces in society. It's tough to know if they actually think that, or if they're just, spitefully saying it, playing the fool, so to speak. I think these things actually start to merge after a while, and people lose track, and they really don't know what they're saying, how asinine it sounds. But here's where Lind can, his ideas of power and class are quite powerful. 2, the primary basis of power in modern societies is not personal property, ownership, but influential positions in powerful organizations, public, private, and nonprofit. And here we start to loop together the various things which I've been talking about to do with Lind. So this group of people, this 10% that I talked about, they don't own the Facebook, or they don't own the government office they work at, or they don't own the university HR department. But nonetheless, they're in the decision-making position at Twitter or Facebook censorship, or at the HR department, which makes a decision about whether a student gets in or not based on some tweet they found from them 7 years ago, or who works in marketing at a big multinational that runs an ad which is pro BLM while they're selling you a $7 Starbucks cup, which statistically the inner city, what percent of inner city poor Black people affected by BLM and defund the police can afford or even go to, I mean, these are sort of parody level ideas at this point. But again, it's sort of this group and this aspiration to be part of this group, and then their positions within the modern society in economic, cultural, public and private decision-making positions that that Lynn's pointing to. And then here we get to the entry and sort of entry into and then recreation of this group over time, generations, etc. Of course, within the context of changing norms within the group and also changing members of the group as time passes. But nonetheless, access to these influential positions chiefly depends on education credentials. So, I mean, these days you're not doing anything in this sort of set of government, tech, and the economy, the media, without a four-year university degree, which in the States is extremely expensive. Same in Canada. I mean, also in the UK, and which or where these sort of set of ideas are indoctrinated or socialized into the new members, and which also acts as a kind of test to let you through or not. So it's sort of the perfect system in the sense of without even a sort of top-down control. It manages to replicate itself in this extremely powerful and binding way. So I mean, just think about saying something against the norm in 2020. These, you know, your position at the university as a student or prof or in the company is really at risk these days if you sort of or speak out too strongly against these sort of set of norms. So I mean, I would even imagine what I said about Black Lives Matter and the Black social suffering 5 minutes ago, if clipped and shown at my workplace or future to future employers, could get me in trouble or could find me fired potentially, which is just extremely ironic given sort of my background, where I'm from in Toronto, and my extremely multicultural sort of friend group, in particular, you know, really with among Black people, typically Caribbean background Canadians, also African, over the years since, you know, an extremely young age, right up until today. But I mean, that's not to say that one can't hold racist positions and have you know, friends of different races, but that's besides the point. But I mean, I think in my case, it's just particularly ridiculous. But still, it's a dangerous subject to talk about these days. And and I mean, this is a little bit of a one that I would not place as much weight on, but those who obtain education credentials disproportionately come from families with members who possess similar credentials. Now, yes, it's statistically probably can be shown that, you know, the university educated, their children also go to university and so on, and they replicate this sort of managerial class group. But I wouldn't play up the degree to which that's true, especially in Western urban cities. I mean, if I take Canada, Toronto is my example. I mean, just the number of immigrants and their kids who are sending their kids to university sort of blows this idea out of the water. I would rather focus on the degree to which they're being socialized into the sort of this managerial class set of ideas than some kind of tightly replicating class of their actual descendants who can get into the universities. Of course, there's something to it if you're on the outside, somewhere in the heartland, U.S. or Canada. But still, I wouldn't play up 4 as much as probably the other 3. And here we go. So that's his description of the class. And this is where he gets juicy. So he starts off by saying, and now just keep in mind the Fukuyama critique of liberalism description. Level 1, shallow or to some degree surface, was economic neoliberalism. And 2 was the inherent contradictory forces within liberalism itself. And here's Lin rephrasing this. To quote, and this is him from the book, and I'll just quote this because I think it's very, very nice the way he's put it. To quote the saying of the radicals of the 60s, the issue is not the issue. I actually didn't know that quote, but I mean, it's nice in what it describes. If the immediate issues that animate mostly native working class populism in particular countries, and then here he lists the sort of set of grievances that apparently animate or anger or sort of rally up those who vote for the populists in the various countries. Immigration and trade for Trump, immigration and sovereignty for Brexiteers, sovereignty vis-a-vis the EU, of course. High levels of Muslim immigration for Germany and Scandinavian populists. Fuel prices and other domestic policies whose costs fall chiefly on the peripheral working class, in the case of the French Yellow Vest protesters, are not the issue. What is the issue? So, I mean, it's sort of, we have to take for granted that those are not the full set of issues that are really activating these groups to vote for sort of totally anti-establishment politicians. So back to his thesis. The issue is power. Social power exists in three realms: government, the economy, and culture. Each of these three realms of social power is the site of class conflict, sometimes intense and sometimes contained by interclass compromises. All three realms of Western society today are fronts in the new class war. And here he describes now, again, so if we just think about Fukuyama from 20 minutes ago, Lin describes technocratic neoliberalism. The technocratic neoliberal revolution from above, carried out in one Western nation after another by members of the ever more aggressive and powerful managerial elite, has provoked a populist backlash from below by the defensive and disempowered native working class, many of whom, and this sort of flies in the face of the mainstream New York Times view, are non-white. A substantial minority of Black and ethnic British voters supported Brexit, and in the US, an estimated 29% of Latinos voted for Trump in 2016. So this number is even higher in 2020, and you may be aware that 20% of male Blacks voted for Trump in 2020. And for a really nice breakdown of the Latino vote, or more like the sort of liberal left conception of the Latino in America, the Mexican voter, and how could they possibly vote for Trump? There's an amazing blog post, pull request by Antonio Martinez, the author of Chaos Monkeys, and he juxtaposes Cubans who tend to be quite conservative, and various strands of sort of aspirational Mexican immigrants in the U.S. And their voting patterns and views about, for instance, the border wall, or about Trump's opinions, or about their lives in America, very nicely. I'll link to the article. First of all, it's very well written, and he links to some imagery and tweets, which really deliver the message nicely. So he's a great guy to follow in any case, and I'll link to his Twitter as well. Large numbers of alienated working class voters, realizing that the political systems of their nations are rigged and that mainstream parties will continue to ignore their interests and values, have found sometimes unlikely champions in demagogic populists. We know the names. The hegemonic ideology of the transatlantic elite. Technocratic neoliberalism, again, the hegemonic ideology of the transatlantic elite, pretends, and this is quite powerful, that inherited class status has virtually disappeared in societies that are purely meritocratic, with the exception of racism, I should say, and misogyny. Neoliberals tend to attribute populism to bigotry and frustration on the part of maladjusted individuals, or a resurgence of 1930s fascism, fascism, or Vladimir Putin's nationalist regime. So you could just channel your favorite image of Hillary talking about the deplorables to sort of get what this one's describing here. Conservatives, again, part of this elite nonetheless, although I previously described that they wouldn't necessarily make up a lot of the sort of managerial class that Lynn describes. Conservatives claim that the economic elite is not semi-hereditary, but rather an ever-changing kaleidoscope aggregate of talented and hardworking individuals. So, I mean, I don't want to go deeply into this, but you know the argument. I'm sure you've seen it, and there's of course some truth to it again. But I think certain people would, based on their life experience, chuckle at such a sort of factual statement. And then, of course, Marxism takes class and class conflict seriously, as Lynn says here, but orthodox Marxism has always been absurd. Yeah, I mean, fair enough. I would agree. So I think he takes what we can take from it and dismiss it as it should be. The populists strike back. The populists strike back. So now he turns to the populist response, or the populist sort of positions. Now that we sort of understand who the voters are and who the managerial elite class is. For all their differences, these populist demagogues have launched similar counterattacks on dominant neoliberal establishments in all three realms of social power. In the realm of the economy, populists favor national restrictions on trade and immigration to shield workers from competing with imports and immigrants. So, I mean, Brexit is somehow this directly, but of course Trump came in with some very powerful or strong words and policies vis-a-vis China, but also Germany, or in the EU, and a lot of discourse about trade to bring jobs, so sort of bring jobs back to the Rust Belt of the U.S. I mean, and this was also coached in sort of talk of national security, so related to, for instance, steel production, and then of course immigration. And anyone who's sort of reasonably well versed in economic and social political theory and history would is aware that this idea number one here is, at least traditionally, a left-leaning position, not a right-leaning position. But these days it's counter the neoliberal technocratic sort of position, rationalized again by a certain school of economics, and it's xenophobic to hold. Just as a side point, for instance, Eric Weinstein is pretty strong on sort of anti-immigrant or immigration restrictions. I mean, I would say I also am. As a Canadian, we're in a rather fortunate position of having a strong immigration policy and relatively inaccessible country, so we can be very selective with our immigration, and then as a result have a fairly successful immigration sort of integration system, or outcomes via our point system, and who we're able to let in, which is an enormous advantage also for multiculturalism and containing xenophobic sort of views versus the US or even Europe. In the realm of politics, populists denounce neoliberal parties and factions as corrupt and elitist, so to sort of clear the swamp. And in the realm of culture, populists denounce elite promulgated multiculturalism and globalism, while deliberately flouting the norms of the politically correct etiquette that marks membership in the university-educated managerial elite. Now, I mean, depending who you are at this point, you're gonna sort of say, well, 1, 2. I mean, two is tough to argue with. The question is, I think, if you're sort of anti-populist, you're going to say, well, we know how they do this when they actually try to clear the swamp. depending on what you've been told about economics and your sort of xenophobic socialization. So again, sort of the degree to which you buy the mainstream sort of set of ideas, you're going to be either totally against immigration restrictions or talk against immigrants. You probably won't care much about trade. That's my experience about sort of millennials and economic policy. And on culture, you're certainly not going to like any talk against multiculturalism and globalism. Depending where you're from, nationalism is either a terrible word if you're in Germany. If you're a Canadian or an American, typically, you even as a very left-leaning person, the Canadian flag and sort of Tim Hortons. Now I'm really channeling the Canadian part. Doesn't get you all anti-Nazi'd up, but that's sort of changing as well. So again, depending who you are and how politically, sort of active and versed you are, these may or may not even be too bad for you. You may be surprised that this is what populists do. Populism is a bad word, but these mean very little to you, the 1, 2, and 3, in terms of being absolutely negative. I would say as someone who was pretty anti-woke left back in the 2000s, these would have been pretty mainstream positions for somebody who would have thought Noam Chomsky was a pretty reasonable describer of sort of geopolitics and the economy. But these norms change, and this is now what populists do, so we have to dislike it. And here we have Lind himself providing his within the system sort of solution or description. And again, quoting him, "But sharing wealth through redistribution and symbolic gestures of respect are unlikely to end the new class war if the small managerial overclass is not willing to share genuine power with the working class majority. Achieving a genuine class peace in the democracies of the West will require uniting and empowering both native and immigrant workers while restoring genuine decision-making power to the non-university educated majority in all three realms of power, the economy, politics, and culture." And now in bold, "Demagogic populism is a symptom. Technocratic neoliberalism is the disease. Democratic pluralism is the cure." Now, I'm a little bit iffy on Lind's actual solution. I think it's a bit wishy-washy. He wants to stay within the system, which is, part of the reason that I introduced this whole liberalism and its discontents framework at the beginning. It's clear that Lind wants to definitely stay within the system. He sees that breaking out of the system or trying to break the system is too dangerous and throws too much out, with it, with which I agree. But I think his description here at the end, there needs to be a sort of power sharing, potentially a liking of the sort of middle Americans, to return to the U.S. Example, by the managerial class. It doesn't seem like a concrete solution. I think I'll leave it at that.